Three names disappeared from the lineup card. And nobody in that clubhouse expected it. Not the players who had been penciled into those spots for weeks. Not the beat reporters who had built their pre-game coverage around the assumption that the lineup would look the way it had looked for the better part of a month. Not even some of the coaching staff, who learned about the full scope of the changes only hours before first pitch against Baltimore. The Dodgers had completed a 3-for-1 trade. And in the same news cycle, before anyone had fully processed what that trade meant for the roster, the starting lineup for the opening game against the Orioles arrived. And it didn't look like an adjustment. It looked like a reconstruction. 3 shocking changes. 3 players moved out of positions they had occupied for the better part of the season. And standing in the middle of it all, fielding question after question from reporters who wanted to understand the logic behind what they were seeing, was Dave Roberts. He didn't soften it. There was no other way. Let's go back to where this actually started. Because lineup changes this significant don't happen in isolation. They don't arrive out of a single bad week or a single uninspired performance. They arrive because a front office and a coaching staff have been watching something develop over time, weighing it against what they need heading into the stretch of the season that actually determines whether a year is remembered as successful or forgettable. The Dodgers were not a struggling team. That much was clear in the standings. But standings only tell part of the story. Beneath the overall record, there were patterns that Roberts and his staff had been tracking. Matchup vulnerabilities. Situational weaknesses. The kind of detail that doesn't show up in a box score but shows up clearly on film, in the meetings that happen behind closed doors, in the conversations between a manager and his front office about what needs to change before the part of the season that actually matters. The 3-for-1 trade was the first piece of the answer. 3 players moving out of the organization. 1 player arriving in return. On paper, it reads like an unusual exchange, the kind of trade that requires explanation before it makes sense. But like the earlier moves this organization has made this season, the math was never about equal value changing hands in a vacuum. It was about fit. About what specific gaps needed to be filled and what specific pieces had become expendable in pursuit of filling them. Friedman made the calculation. The deal was completed. And almost immediately, the ripple effects began moving through the rest of the roster. The lineup against the Orioles was where those ripple effects became visible to everyone. 3 changes. Significant ones. Players who had been everyday contributors suddenly found themselves removed from the starting 9, replaced by alternatives that surprised even some of the people who cover this team closely on a daily basis. This was not a case of resting a veteran against a tough left-handed starter. This was not a minor defensive realignment based on the Orioles' specific lineup construction. This was structural. When the full lineup card was released before first pitch, there was a visible reaction in the press box. Reporters who had been preparing their pre-game notes based on the expected lineup had to rewrite significant portions of their coverage. Texts went out. Phone calls were made. The kind of scramble that happens when a major league team does something that nobody outside the organization saw coming. And in the middle of all of it, Roberts walked into his pre-game media session knowing exactly what the first question was going to be. He didn't wait for it. "I know what everyone's going to ask," he said, before the first reporter had even raised a hand. "So let me just get into it." He talked about preparation. About the long view of the season. About decisions that look uncomfortable in the short term but that the coaching staff believes are necessary for the version of this team they need to become before October arrives. He was specific without being dismissive of the players who had been moved. He praised their contributions. He acknowledged the difficulty of what those conversations had been like in the hours before the lineup was finalized. But he did not back away from the decision. There was no other way, he said again, this time slower, with more weight behind each word. We looked at everything. We looked at the matchups, we looked at the long-term construction of this roster, we looked at what we need from this lineup heading into the toughest part of our schedule. And every path led us to the same conclusion. A reporter pushed further, asking specifically whether the trade had forced his hand, whether the roster construction had left him without flexibility to maintain the lineup as it had existed before. Roberts paused. "The trade gave us new information," he said carefully. "New pieces. New possibilities. And once you have new possibilities, you have an obligation to consider them seriously, even if the conclusion is uncomfortable." That word, obligation, sat heavily in the room. Because it reframed the entire situation. This wasn't simply a manager making changes because he could. This was a manager describing a decision he felt required to make, even knowing the difficulty it would create inside his own clubhouse. The players affected by the changes responded with the kind of professionalism that characterizes a clubhouse built around accountability rather than entitlement. There were no public complaints. No anonymous quotes finding their way into reporters' notebooks expressing frustration with the decision. Whatever conversations happened privately, the way Roberts has always insisted those conversations should happen. But the silence from the affected players didn't mean the moment lacked emotional weight. One veteran, speaking carefully when asked about his removal from the starting role he had held for most of the season, chose his words with obvious restraint. "It's not the news you want to hear," he said. "But I trust this coaching staff. I trust what they're building toward. My job right now is to be ready whenever I'm called on, and that's what I'm going to do." That kind of response, delivered without visible bitterness, says something about the culture Roberts has built over years of managing this specific roster through exactly these kinds of difficult moments. A lesser clubhouse fractures under decisions like this. This one absorbed it. And then there was Ohtani. Before the game began, before the new lineup took the field for the first time, Ohtani approached Mookie Betts. The conversation was brief. Quiet. The kind of exchange that wouldn't have drawn any attention at all if a member of the broadcast crew positioned near the dugout hadn't happened to catch the moment on camera. Nobody outside the two of them knows exactly what was said. But the moment carried weight regardless of its content, because of what it represented. Betts, one of the players whose role had shifted under the new lineup construction, found himself approached by the best player on the team, perhaps the best player in the sport, in the moments before a game that would test the new structure for the first time. Ohtani is not a vocal leader in the traditional sense. He does not deliver inspirational speeches in the clubhouse. He does not position himself as the emotional center of this team in any performative way. His leadership has always operated differently. Through example. Through preparation. Through the quiet consistency of showing up every single day and doing the work at a level that makes everyone around him better simply by proximity. So when he chose, in that specific moment, to walk over to Betts and have a private conversation before a game built around significant structural change, it meant something. The players in that dugout noticed. The coaching staff noticed. And while none of them would confirm the content of the exchange, several acknowledged afterward that whatever Ohtani said, Betts looked different walking out to his position than he had looked walking off the field during warm-ups. More settled. More ready. The game itself, once it finally began, carried the particular tension of a lineup being tested in real time for the first time. Every early at-bat from the new additions felt magnified. Every defensive play in unfamiliar positioning felt like it was being evaluated not just for its immediate impact but for what it confirmed or contradicted about Roberts' decision. The new pieces from the trade performed admirably in their debut, settling into the lineup with the kind of composure that suggested the coaching staff had prepared them thoroughly for this exact moment. There was no visible hesitation. No sign that the magnitude of stepping into a reshuffled Dodgers lineup against a divisional-style opponent was overwhelming them. And through it all, Ohtani did what Ohtani does. Steady production. Quality at-bats. The kind of presence in the lineup that provides stability regardless of what else is shifting around him. His performance in that game wasn't the headline. But it was the foundation that allowed everything else happening around him to feel less precarious than it might have otherwise. By the time the game reached its later innings, the early tension surrounding the new lineup had largely dissolved into the normal rhythm of a baseball game being played competently by professionals who had adjusted to their circumstances. The Orioles presented a difficult opponent, the kind of team capable of exploiting uncertainty in an opposing roster. But the uncertainty that had existed before first pitch had not translated into uncertainty on the field. Roberts watched from the dugout with the specific posture of a manager whose decision was being validated in real time, inning by inning, at-bat by at-bat. He didn't celebrate prematurely. He didn't allow his expression to suggest that one game had answered every question raised by the trade and the lineup reconstruction. But there was something in the way he moved through the dugout, the way he communicated with his coaching staff between innings, that suggested a level of confidence in what they had built. After the game, when reporters returned to ask the follow-up questions that the pre-game controversy had generated, Roberts was more relaxed than he had been hours earlier. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you everything is figured out after one game," he said. "But I liked what I saw. I liked how everyone responded. I liked the professionalism in that clubhouse today, from guys who had every reason to be frustrated and chose instead to compete." A reporter asked specifically about the conversation between Ohtani and Betts before the game, whether Roberts had any insight into what was discussed. He smiled slightly. The first genuinely relaxed expression he had shown throughout the entire pre-game and post-game process. "That's between them," he said. "But I'll say this. Whatever Shohei said to him, it worked. There is a broader pattern emerging across this Dodgers season that this moment fits cleanly into. A front office willing to make uncomfortable roster decisions in pursuit of long-term advantage. A manager willing to stand in front of cameras and own those decisions publicly, without hedging, without deflecting blame onto circumstances beyond his control. A clubhouse culture strong enough to absorb difficult news without fracturing. And at the center of all of it, a superstar whose influence extends beyond his individual performance into the quiet, unglamorous work of keeping a locker room together when the structure around it is being rebuilt in real time. The Orioles series was always going to be a test. Not just of talent, but of how well this reshaped roster could function together under the pressure of meaningful early competition. The first test has been passed. But Roberts knows, and everyone in that organization knows, that one game does not validate a season's worth of difficult decisions. The lineup that took the field against Baltimore will continue to be evaluated, continue to be adjusted, continue to be shaped by the same unflinching organizational philosophy that produced it in the first place. There was no other way, Roberts said. And on this night, at least, the way they chose worked exactly as intended.